I never thought a simple trip to celebrate my daughter's birthday would turn into the most humiliating day of our lives. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Lark, and my daughter Jovi had just turned 9. We arrived at my in-laws' house, expecting a small celebration. Gideon and Marnie, my husband Ron's parents, were already there, smiling politely. The house smelled of cake and candles, but something felt off. Before I could react, they told Jovi she needed to scrub the kitchen floor. I froze. Everyone else, including other children, was leaving for ice cream, laughing and chatting. Jovi's face fell, her small hands gripping the mop like it was a punishment. My heart sank. I wanted to stop them, to pick her up and leave, but Ron didn't say a word. He just watched. Hours passed. Jovi scrubbed, her tiny arms aching, while the others enjoyed treats and games outside. I felt anger, shame, and helplessness all at once. How could they do this to my daughter? How could they turn a birthday into a lesson in cruelty? I held back tears as I knelt beside her, whispering that this wasn't her fault. In that moment, I made a decision. They would not break her spirit. They would not break mine. I would find a way to make them pay, not with anger, but by showing them they could never control or humiliate us again. Jovi finished the floor that day stronger than she began. And I promised myself that the humiliation they thought would crush us would be the start of a reckoning they would never forget. Before that birthday, there were signs I had ignored. Gideon and Marnie had always treated Jovi differently from other kids, praising cousins while brushing her achievements aside. I noticed it at holidays, dinners, even small family gatherings. Their smiles never reached her. Their praise never landed on her. I tried to speak up many times, but my words were met with polite nods that went nowhere. "She'll understand someday," Marnie would say, dismissing my concerns. I watched Jovi shrink quietly in corners, holding herself small to avoid drawing attention. Every attempt I made to shield her felt like swimming against a cold, unmoving current. Ron, my husband, often stood by silently. He saw it, heard it, yet did nothing. I tried to explain how her confidence was being chipped away, how her happiness was ignored, but he just shook his head, telling me not to overthink. I felt frustrated, trapped between protecting my child and respecting my husband's calm passivity. The cold treatment wasn't just toward Jovi. I felt it too. Suggestions I made for family plans were overlooked. Opinions about traditions dismissed. I began to notice a pattern: their family valued appearances and control more than kindness or fairness. I learned to tread carefully, to pick my battles, and to defend my daughter in quiet, invisible ways. Looking back, the birthday incident wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of years of subtle cruelty and favoritism, moments of silence that spoke louder than words. I realized then that if I wanted Jovi safe, happy, and respected, I couldn't rely on anyone else. I had to act. And I had to act wisely. Jovi's small shoulders slumped as she scrubbed, her eyes welling with tears she tried to hide. I could see the confusion in her gaze, the question she didn't dare voice: why me? She felt exposed, embarrassed, and isolated, as if the world had singled her out for punishment. Each swipe of the mop seemed heavier than the last, not because of the work, but because of the weight of being rejected by the very people who were supposed to care. I felt my chest tighten, torn between stepping in and staying quiet. Part of me wanted to storm the room, snatch her up, and confront them in anger. Another part reminded me that any misstep could make things worse, for Jovi and for me. I weighed my words, my movements, my options, every second feeling like a trap. The house around us felt suffocating. Laughter echoed from rooms we couldn't enter, mingling with the smells of sweets and warmth that felt like a cruel joke. The family, united in their disregard, made the betrayal sting even more. Ron stood nearby, indifferent, his silence deepening the wound. I realized that this wasn't just about a birthday or a single task. It was a reflection of a pattern, a quiet exclusion that left us vulnerable, powerless, and unseen. Jovi's sadness mirrored my own anger and fear. Her small hands, once full of curiosity and play, now moved mechanically, teaching me a harsh lesson about the lengths people would go to assert control. I clenched my jaw, forcing calm while plotting inside. Their united front had made them believe they could break us. But beneath the shame and hurt, a resolve began to form. I promised myself, no matter the fear, I would find a way to protect her and reclaim the dignity they had tried to steal. That night, after putting Jovi to bed, I sat alone in the quiet house and felt something settle inside me. I knew I couldn't allow what happened to fade away like another unpleasant memory. The hurt she carried, the silence around us, the way they acted as if nothing was wrong, none of it could remain unanswered. I decided that if they wanted to act without kindness, then I would respond with strategy, not emotion. I began paying close attention to every interaction. I noted the small comments, the controlling behavior, the dismissive tones. I kept track of situations that revealed their true nature. I didn't confront anyone yet, instead, I watched with purpose. Each detail became a piece I stored carefully, preparing for the right moment. I also studied the way Gideon and Marnie handled their world. They had habits, routines, and soft spots. They liked order, predictability, and admiration. They disliked anything that challenged their authority or threatened their perfect image. Learning this helped me understand where their cracks were. I didn't rush. I simply observed, quietly collecting information that would later guide my actions. Patience became my strength. I acted normal around them, never revealing the shift inside me. I smiled when needed, listened when required, and kept my thoughts hidden. Beneath that calm surface, I was building a plan shaped by careful thinking, not anger. Every choice I made from that point forward had intention. I wasn't looking for chaos. I wanted accountability. I wanted fairness. And most of all, I wanted to ensure Jovi would never be placed in a position like that again. My resolve grew stronger each day. They believed they still controlled the situation, but they had no idea that I had stepped into a different role, one that watched, learned, and prepared for the time when their actions would be returned to them in full. As days passed, I started seeing a pattern in Gideon and Marnie's behavior. In front of neighbors and guests, they were gracious, cheerful, and charitable. They hosted parties, offered gifts, and spoke about kindness as if it were their nature. But behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. The same smiles vanished, replaced by impatience, harsh words, and a constant need to assert dominance. I noticed how carefully they controlled every interaction. Friends and relatives were praised only when convenient, criticized when it suited them. Small favors were given as if they were owed respect in return. Any perceived challenge, no matter how minor, was met with subtle punishment or cold disregard. It became clear that their generosity wasn't genuine, it was a tool, a mask designed to keep everyone in line while protecting their perfect image. I began to watch how they treated other people in the household. Instructions were given with a sharp edge, mistakes were highlighted to embarrass rather than teach, and affection was conditional. They thrived on control, and the more powerless someone felt, the more they seemed to enjoy it. Even more striking was their obsession with appearances. Every surface, every outfit, every gesture was carefully curated. Any imperfection, real or imagined, was criticized or hidden. I realized this obsession dictated every decision they made, from trivial household choices to how they presented themselves to the outside world. Recognizing these patterns became empowering. I could predict their reactions, anticipate their moves, and understand the subtle ways they manipulated others. I didn't have to react emotionally anymore, I could act strategically. Their public generosity and private cruelty were no longer mysteries, they were weaknesses I could use, carefully and deliberately, to protect myself and Jovi. Once I understood how they operated, I began taking small steps, not enough to draw attention, but enough to unsettle their sense of control. It started with little truths they preferred hidden. When they exaggerated their involvement in a community project, I casually mentioned the real organizers during a conversation, making it clear their version wasn't accurate. They had to nod and adjust their story, annoyed but unable to challenge me without revealing their intentions. At home, I made tiny changes that disrupted their routines. Items they relied on were moved slightly, not enough to cause chaos, but enough to force them to search, question, and wonder. Schedules they tried to impose shifted when I accidentally double-booked or reminded someone of an earlier agreement they thought others had forgotten. These inconveniences were small, but they chipped away at their confidence in their own control. Through all of this, I made sure Jovi felt seen. When she noticed something that didn't add up, I listened closely. When she expressed doubt about herself, I countered it with calm reassurance and clear examples of her strength. She began to understand that she didn't have to accept every unkind action without question. Seeing me quietly resist gave her a new sense of comfort. She watched me stand firm without raising my voice, and it taught her that strength didn't always need to be loud. She started walking with more confidence, speaking a little clearer, meeting people's eyes again. These small shifts didn't erase what had happened, but they marked the beginning of something new. I could feel the balance slowly shifting. The people who once dictated every moment were no longer as steady as they believed, and Jovi no longer felt alone. Each subtle move brought us closer to taking back what they tried so hard to control. I realized that facing Gideon and Marnie alone wouldn't be enough. Their control extended beyond our home, and their charm fooled outsiders. I began quietly reaching out to people I trusted, neighbors who had glimpsed their harshness, family friends who had confided in me about similar experiences. Each conversation was careful, brief, and cautious. I didn't want them to suspect my intentions too soon. Slowly, a network formed. One neighbor mentioned how they had been pressured into hosting events under false pretenses. Another relative admitted they had been manipulated into defending the in-laws publicly, even when it felt wrong. I listened carefully, taking notes mentally and sometimes on paper, storing every detail. Each story added context to what Jovi and I had endured, showing that the pattern of cruelty extended further than I had imagined. At the same time, I began collecting tangible evidence, receipts, invitations, notes, and subtle inconsistencies in their stories. Nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to later demonstrate the truth of their behavior. I made sure to remain discreet. They could not know I was building this web of accountability. Jovi noticed the shift in me. I explained that sometimes, help comes from people who understand, and that we don't have to face everything alone. She began to feel safer, knowing that others had witnessed the same unfairness. Her small smiles returned, and I could see a flicker of hope in her eyes. By the end of those weeks, I had more than just observations, I had allies, stories, and proof. The foundation was laid for a confrontation that would finally make Gideon and Marnie realize their actions had consequences. We were no longer isolated. Quietly, patiently, we were preparing to reclaim our lives. It happened again during a small family gathering. Jovi, excited and hopeful, tried to join the other children in a game, but Gideon and Marnie singled her out. They made her fetch drinks, clean up spilled snacks, and perform little chores while everyone else laughed and played. Her face fell, and I could see the same hurt from her birthday reflected in her eyes. That familiar mix of shame and confusion pushed something inside me past the edge. This time, I wouldn't stay quiet. I had been planning quietly for weeks, and the pieces were finally in place. I guided the evening carefully, suggesting activities that would expose their inconsistencies without appearing suspicious. Guests, who had never seen the private side of Gideon and Marnie, were subtly positioned to witness the contrast between their charming public persona and the cruel control they wielded at home. As the night unfolded, I let small moments play out naturally. Marnie boasted about her generosity to neighbors, while Jovi, encouraged gently by me, calmly shared details that highlighted the unfair treatment she had endured. Gideon tried to correct the story, but every explanation contradicted facts I had quietly prepared for the occasion. The tension in the room shifted. Smiles froze, polite nods faltered, and the in-laws' confidence cracked. They could no longer maintain the illusion of perfection. Guests began to murmur, noticing the contradictions. The embarrassment that surged across their faces mirrored exactly the emotional hurt they had caused Jovi months ago. I stayed calm, watching silently as the truth revealed itself. For the first time, the imbalance of power had shifted. Jovi's eyes sparkled with quiet pride, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The public humiliation they had inflicted so freely was now reflected back on them, carefully, deliberately, and fully deserved. After the gathering, I knew subtle exposure wasn't enough. Their cruelty ran deeper than I had imagined, and I needed formal steps to protect Jovi and ensure accountability. I began compiling a detailed record of every incident, every slight, and every unfair demand. Dates, times, descriptions, everything went into a secure folder. Each note reinforced the seriousness of what had been happening, and each pattern revealed the consistent way they exerted control over our lives. I researched options quietly. Family mediation could create a neutral environment to discuss grievances, while property rights gave me leverage in disputes over shared spaces. Most importantly, I considered reporting the abuse to child protection authorities. It wasn't about punishment alone, it was about making sure Jovi would never again face public humiliation or emotional neglect under their roof. I approached these steps deliberately, making sure each move was measured. Every decision was strategic, aimed at creating evidence that could not be dismissed or manipulated. I wasn't acting out of rage anymore, I was building a case. The goal was clear: protection for my daughter, and accountability for the people who thought they could treat us with impunity. The tension in my chest grew as I imagined the in-laws realizing that their private cruelty might be exposed in official settings. I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve, knowing that this path demanded patience, thoroughness, and precision. Through it all, Jovi watched, sensing my determination. She began to trust that the situation could change, that we weren't powerless. With each form filled, each record carefully filed, the stakes rose, and with them, a quiet satisfaction that the in-laws' behavior could no longer go unchecked. We were preparing for consequences, and they were about to feel the weight of their choices. The day of the confrontation arrived, and I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I gathered the evidence I had carefully collected: notes, photos, and accounts from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. Everything was organized, ready to speak for itself. I invited Gideon and Marnie to a meeting in the living room, and Roan joined, unaware of the full extent of what I planned to show. I began calmly, presenting each example of their behavior in a factual, composed way. I didn't shout or accuse, I let the proof speak. Every cruel comment, every act of favoritism, every humiliation Jovi endured was documented. Their reactions shifted from disbelief to anger, and finally, to a tense silence as the undeniable truth became clear. Roan could no longer look away. His usual passivity cracked as I asked pointed questions: why he had stood by, why he had allowed their actions, and how he could justify silence while his daughter suffered. I could see the shame settle across his face. He had been complicit, even without speaking. Gideon tried to deflect, Marnie attempted charm, but nothing worked. Their carefully constructed facade collapsed under the weight of evidence and witnesses. Jovi sat beside me, her small hand in mine, watching as the people who had caused her so much pain were finally confronted. The room was tense, every word heavy with consequence. I felt a rush of relief, mixed with pride, as I realized we had reclaimed our voice. This confrontation wasn't about revenge alone, it was about truth, recognition, and finally standing up for ourselves. By the end, the air felt different. Jovi's eyes shone with quiet triumph, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time, the power they had wielded so easily over us was gone, replaced by accountability they could no longer avoid. After the confrontation, a quiet victory settled over me. For the first time, I could see that the narrative had shifted. I controlled the story now. What had been hidden, twisted, or ignored was finally acknowledged. Every word I had recorded, every subtle act of injustice, now reflected the truth, and it was undeniable. Jovi looked at me with a mixture of awe and relief. The tension that had weighed on her for so long began to lift. She no longer flinched at minor criticisms or feared standing in the room. Her laughter returned in small bursts, cautious but genuine, and she held her head higher. For her, the moment meant safety, validation, and the knowledge that her voice mattered. Meanwhile, Gideon and Marnie could feel the unease I had carefully orchestrated. They had attempted control, but now it was stripped away. Their faces, usually confident and composed, carried traces of discomfort. The subtle humiliation they had imposed on us was mirrored back at them, restrained but unmistakable. I didn't need to shout or dramatize, the weight of truth alone was enough to unsettle them. The shift wasn't dramatic or public, it was internal, profound, and deliberate. Every glance, every awkward pause, reminded them of their missteps and the consequences of their cruelty. They had underestimated me, underestimated the depth of my patience, and the quiet strength that had grown in the face of repeated humiliation. In those moments, I felt a sense of calm power. Jovi's safety, her restored confidence, and the in-laws' awareness of their failures all combined into a quiet triumph that spoke louder than anger ever could. The balance had finally tipped, and I knew we would never again be victims in a household that had tried to diminish us. Life after the confrontation felt different in ways both subtle and profound. The air at home no longer carried the tension that had shadowed every interaction. Jovi walked through the rooms with ease, her confidence no longer masked by caution. The atmosphere shifted because we were no longer subjects of control or ridicule, we had reclaimed our place. I established clear boundaries. No longer would chores or favors be used to belittle us. I communicated expectations calmly but firmly, making it clear that manipulation and cruelty would not be tolerated. The rules were simple: respect, honesty, and space for Jovi to grow without fear. These lines, once unspoken, now guided our interactions and allowed us to breathe freely. Ron's perspective began to change as well. Facing his own inaction forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his behavior. He could no longer hide behind neutrality. Conversations became honest, reflective, and sometimes tense, but slowly, he started to take responsibility. I noticed effort in his tone, a willingness to learn from mistakes, and a growing respect for the steps I had taken to protect our daughter. Through it all, I discovered a strength within myself I hadn't fully recognized before. Patience, planning, and quiet determination had carried us through the worst moments. I learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about shaping the environment around us, ensuring safety and dignity, and guiding Jovi with conviction. We were no longer defined by the cruelty we had endured. Every decision, every boundary, and every small victory reinforced our growth. Jovi thrived in the newfound stability, and I embraced the power of standing firm. In reclaiming our lives, I had become stronger, and our family, once trapped in fear, had finally found freedom. Sitting quietly one evening, I reflected on everything that had happened, the humiliation, the silences, the moments when I felt powerless. That day of betrayal, once so sharp and vivid in my memory, had become the catalyst for change. I realized that what had once hurt us so deeply had also taught us resilience, strategy, and the value of standing firm. Jovi, once hesitant and shy, now moved through her world with a confidence I had never seen before. Her laughter returned fully, no longer tinged with fear or doubt. Every small step she took, every question she asked without hesitation, reminded me of how far we had come. Together, we had rebuilt the sense of safety and trust that had been stripped away. I also rebuilt my own life. I no longer carried the weight of their judgments or the tension of being second-guessed at every turn. The boundaries I had established became shields, ensuring that no one could impose control over us again. Each day was an affirmation of our strength, our dignity, and our ability to thrive despite past cruelty. Looking back, I understood that revenge wasn't about anger, it was about reclaiming what had been taken and creating a life where my daughter and I could flourish. It was about showing that patience, planning, and quiet determination could transform pain into empowerment. And so, as I watched Jovi play, her eyes bright with trust and joy, I felt a deep sense of completion. We had faced betrayal and turned it into power. Every tear, every moment of doubt, had led us to this point. We were never just victims, we were survivors, and I made sure they would never forget it.